Well, I think Trump himself defined Trumpism for us, Jen, when he rolled down the escalator in 2015 in Trump Tower to announce his candidacy. And it was a very powerful, divisive, and successful campaign message. He wedded anti-institutionalism and anti-elitism to very broad-based identity politics, us versus them, all of which was shrouded in a very overt bigotry and racism. And he found a lot of appeal and traction around that. He wasn't the ideal ambassador for it because a lot of voters that had typically had an affinity for the GOP were disgusted with his antics, with all of his histrionics, his unpredictability. And I think what you're seeing in these races now are a new wave of candidates who are trying to take Trumpism and shred it of all of his loony antics in order to make it more palatable to a larger base of voters.
And so what about that actually worked, Tim, in your opinion? Because we mentioned with Youngkin, he kind of kept Trump at an arm's length, but clearly that worked for him. So what about the packaging of Trumpism made it successful for him and others?
Well, remember that both the candidates in New Jersey and Virginia early on embraced Trump, and they really showed to their voters and to the GOP base that they were Trumpistas, essentially. When they got into the general election, they distanced themselves. They didn't campaign with Trump. They didn't ask him to speak on their behalf, but there's no question that they invoked all of the values that made Trump a successful candidate for a important part of the GOP, but not a broad part of the GOP. And I think they had an issue with, they gave incredible wind to their candidacies. There's a lot of parents on both sides of the political aisle, Republican and Democrat, who are angry about school closings. And I think they leveraged the feeling that voters had of not having input and having people on the top forcing decisions down upon them into a broader set of issues that evoke the idea that racism and issues around race shouldn't be taught in schools, which I think was pure race baiting, masquerading as parent empowerment. And you saw that really, I think, most vividly with Youngkin in Virginia.
And so then what does that mean for the Democrats and potentially what their strategy could be going into the midterms? I mean, you mentioned the culture wars that were sort of at play, but then also, you know, parents and education. There's a lot of different feelings about how voters are electing people these days.
Well, I think, you know, at least we can never rely purely on polling, but some of the exit polling and pre-election polling that came out, the issues that were biggest for voters in Virginia, for example, the economy, education, and critical race theory of all things, even though most voters in Virginia don't know what critical race theory is, and it is not, in fact, being taught in Virginia schools. Right. The Democrats right now have a robust program that they're trying to push through Congress that's about the economy, but I don't think they've done a good job of messaging around that and selling it to voters.
And I mean, how can they then leverage that, Tim? I mean, would it be President Biden's agenda getting passed, his infrastructure bill?
Well, I do. I mean, the infrastructure bill has bipartisan support. Everyone, I think, recognizes it would be good for the future of the country and good for the economy. Where there's been the flashpoint is around the second part of this, the social spending plan, where there's been a big debate about how much is enough. And unfortunately for the Democrats, that debate has been grounded in what's the dollar size of that program instead of what's its economic efficacy. And for voters, this is about jobs. This is about healthcare. It's about education. It's about enfranchising an important part of the American population. And I don't think that Democrats have been able to take control of the narrative away from Republicans around those issues.
And Tim, I mean, I for anybody who hasn't read your column, they really should, because you get into sort of how this is playing out in your hometown of New Jersey. But what do you think this says about where the country is at this point in time? Is there bigger messaging coming out of Tuesday that we should be aware of?
Well, the bigger messaging is our country has a lot of deep-seated problems that we need to address. And I think we've all told ourselves some myths over the years about how much progress we've made economically in terms of economic equity, how much progress we've made around race relations, racial tolerance, and racism itself. Donald Trump stripped the Band-Aid off those quaint notions. And I think he's really forcing people on both sides of the aisle to stand up and say, what is America about? What do we stand behind? And what are we going to advocate for?
And what do you think that looks like then in 2022, Tim? And not just that, I mean, we could see this play out too in 2024.
Well, I think what these election results in New Jersey and Virginia are roadmaps for the GOP. They know they have a very strong issue around schooling and education that I think they can translate into issues like government overreach, racism, and some of these other facets of the political debate that surfaced in these candidacies and in these campaigns. I think the Democrats are going to have to work very quickly and very hard about how to counter that messaging and then also make it real in their policymaking.
And finally, Tim, we started off the segment hearing from President Biden about what he said yesterday. What do you think his messaging should be sort of going forward after this election?
Well, if Biden doesn't have legislation and programs to point to, his messaging is going to be undermined. He went to the COP summit really without any meaningful environmental legislation he could talk to. If he's going to campaign and going to be out in front of voters over the next several months, he's going to need to point to real progress around legislation in Congress that translates into jobs and economic growth.
And Tim, sorry, I forgot that I had one more question. I mean, we started it saying Trumpism without Trump. You've written about Trump. What do you think his take is then on sort of the strategy of the GOP at this point in time? He can't be that happy about it.
No, and that's a wild card. Donald Trump loves the spotlight. He is not going to be happy with people like Ron DeSantis and Glenn Youngkin and Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley all trying to be Trump light, embracing divisive campaigning, sensationalizing race, talking about us versus them, government overreach, but shunning Trump himself. He is a formidable fundraising machine. He is going to start taking pot shots at some of these people because he doesn't care, I think, about the success of the party as much as he cares about his own personal success.